Hey everyone, Tim Rohr here from Rohr Music Studios, and today we're going to be talking about how to create a kind of a map for a measure to understand how the timing works for different rhythms. In music, we represent the length of a note by its shape. There's a video in which we talk more about this, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description. But for today, we're going to start with the whole note. The oval shape with no stems is what we use to represent a whole note. And we can think of that as being sort of one little length of note. If we were to take our whole note and cut it up into four equal parts, then we would have four quarter notes. And most of the time we actually think in terms of quarter note beats. So a whole note would be four quarter note beats long. If we were to divide up our quarter notes, we get things like eighth notes, 16th notes, and so forth. And for each of these different values, these notes would have different timings, and we need to figure out how these different rhythms would fit together and work together. What can be really useful in a situation like this is to create some sort of a map. In general, having a map can really help us find our way around our environment and understand things around us a little bit better. And we actually have several different ways of creating a map or really mapping out the landscape of our measures. The one that we're going to be talking about is the American traditional counting system. In the American traditional counting system, we label each of our main beats using a number. So the first beat in a measure would be beat 1, the second beat would be beat 2, and so forth. And each of these correspond to kind of a little block of time with which that we would play these. So for the first beat, it would be so long, about this length of time. The second beat, and so forth. And each of those beats would be the same length of time. Using this same system, if we were to divide the beats into half beats, say like eighth notes, we would refer to the extra half a beat after our main beat as the and, say like the and of this or the and of that. So here are our main beats as well as our ands. So this right here would be the and it happens to be the and after 2, so we would refer to that as the and of 2. So if we think now of this in terms of our blocks from earlier, this is kind of how this would be mapped out. First of all, we would have each of our main beats on one of these blocks from earlier, and each quarter note though then would be divided up into two eighth notes, so that we'd have our beat 1 here and beat 2 and 3 and so forth, and that each of these would fit into those other beats, as you saw there. And that we'd have our beat 1 there, the and of 1 right there, the 2 right there, and so forth. Now, in the same system, if we divide up the beats into four equal parts, into quarters of beats, then we would count them as follows: 1 E and 2 E and so forth. And then we can use the same reference with the E and or the of the beat that they follow. For example, this right here, we would call that the E of beat 3. And this would be the of beat 1. If we were to think about kind of our block example from before, we could actually take and divide up each of our eighth notes into two equal 16th notes. And it would take 4 16th notes then to equal 1 quarter note. So here you'd kind of see, here's beat 1, and here's the E of 1, the and of 1, and the of 1 right there. So really the goal of the American traditional counting system, or any counting system, is to have a tool to understand the relationships between notes. There are just some times where there's a rhythm we haven't encountered yet that's a little bit confusing, and using the counting system, we can understand better the relationships between those notes, how they relate to each other. And so we're going to take a couple of strange rhythms, and we're going to use this counting system to map out how these rhythms relate to each other and how we should count them. So we have this right here. This is a syncopated rhythm, and we start with the first note of this measure, which is going to be beat 1. Anytime you have a measure, with very few exceptions, the first of a measure is always going to be beat 1. And it's an eighth note long, so the next note is going to be on an and, the and of 1. Now this next note is a quarter note long, and because of that, our beat 2 is actually landing in the middle of this note. And that would put us on this note right here, which would be on the and of 2. And this one, since it's an eighth note, it's going to carry us into the next right here, which is on beat 3. And if you'll notice that and of 2 is tied into beat 3. Now, often these notes, they'll have this tie right there just to show that halfway mark in the measure. But we could also make these two tied eighth notes. We could put them as a quarter, which some editions do. Some editors will do it this way. Some editors will do it a different way. And if we go further, we've got this right here. Since the previous note was just an eighth note long, then the next one is going to be on, the next note is going to be on the and of 3. And since that's a quarter note, that does put our beat 4 in the middle of this quarter note right there, which then for the last note right there, that puts our note on the and of 4. All right, so let's go ahead and let's hear this example so that we can see how the rhythms work in this measure. So now let's look at another example. This time we're going to use an example that has 16th notes. So we've got our first note that starts on beat 1. And because that is a dotted eighth note, it is going to be 3/16 notes long. So this note would be on beat 1, the E, and the and of 1. And our next note then would be starting on the of 1. It's only a 16th note, so that means that our next note is on beat 2, and it is 2/16 long since it's an eighth note, so it'll be on beat 2 and the E of 2. Then our next one will start on and, it's a 16th, so the next one will be the it's also a 16th, and that moves us on to beat 3. And that one is another one of our dotted eighth notes, and so it's going to be 3/16 notes long. So we have beat 3, the E, and the and beat 3. And our next beat then will be coming in on the of 3. It's tied over, and so this one is actually going to be held for another 4/16 notes after that one. So we've got on the and then 4, E, and Now, once again, let's hear how this example sounds. Now, I hope this has been helpful for you. And I also want to point out that while the counting system doesn't cover all situations such as quintuplets, it really does give a way to start to understand the relationships between beats so that you can play them with the correct timing. It also is a great way to be able to communicate with other musicians, such as, like, let's say that I wanted to say a specific spot to start. I could refer to something like, say, go to the and of beat 4. And other musicians would understand how that works. Thanks for listening, and I will see you guys in our next video.